Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to be back here in San Diego. I'll be tackling a pretty heavy topic today, a question that I'm sure has occurred to most of you at some point. Do we have free will? Certainly feels like we do. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But do we really have free will? Is that feeling of free will actually true? So that's what I want to tackle today. It's a really current topic. Some of you might be aware of some of the recent discussions going on about free will, whether we have free will, among scientists, philosophers, psychologists. And I want to begin with a famous experiment conducted in the 1980s by a scientist named Benjamin Libet. He did an experiment. The details are complicated, but the basic idea was 300 milliseconds before people actually made a conscious decision to do some very simple task like pushing a button, the brains had already decided to do it. Do you follow? They thought that I'm going to push the red button rather than the green button. But 300 milliseconds before they made that conscious decision to do that, the brain had already decided to push the red button rather than the green button. But they weren't aware of it. They weren't aware of the fact that the brain had already made up their mind before they had made that conscious decision. Since then, there have been many other experiments done confirming Libet's results, but people who are familiar with the literature will also know that there's some controversy about what exactly Libet's experiment proves, what it establishes. And it does get complicated, and I don't want to get into the scientific weeds, but I wanted to mention that Sam Harris, somebody that I'm sure many of you have heard of, he wrote a book called Free Will in 2012. And he argues that we have no free will. And one of the main sources of evidence are these Libet-style experiments. And Sam Harris concludes as follows: free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. And more recently, just about a year ago, Robert Sapolsky has published a huge book. He's a professor at Stanford. The book is called Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. He's a neurobiologist. And the book is interesting. It's a dense read, but lively and entertaining. And as one reviewer puts it, Robert Sapolsky's style calls to mind a hugely knowledgeable yet stoned West Coast slacker. Maybe some of us fall into that category. So it's a fun book to read. And he goes much further than Sam Harris. They come to the same conclusion, Sapolsky and Harris: we have no free will. But Sapolsky brings a whole arsenal of kind of scientific, different sources of evidence for it from different fields. It's a very interdisciplinary book, so drawing on neuroscience, philosophy, cognitive science, psychology, and so on, trying to prove that we have no free will in a really definitive way. And another virtue of Sapolsky's book and his methodology is that he doesn't depend so heavily on the Libet-style experiments that Sam Harris depends on. Because if you attack the Libet-style experiments or the results of the Libet-style experiments, then Sam Harris's argument becomes quite shaky. But Sapolsky comes at the same result, arrives at the same result, which is we have no free will, but not relying on Libet. Okay, so what are the main arguments that or the main conclusions that Sapolsky comes to on the basis of his extensive scientific research. Let me just summarize briefly. First, like Sam Harris, Sapolsky says we have no free will. But why? His argument is that all of our behavior, literally the fact that I'm speaking to you now, the way I'm speaking, what I'm talking about, everything is determined by prior causes. The fact that you came out here, also determined completely. Okay, so all our behavior is determined by prior causes, which are those prior causes themselves are determined by other, even more prior causes, going all the way back. Okay, and he fills out the picture quite elegantly and beautifully. Just to give you an example, this is roughly the model that he sketches. So imagine that we take a decision to act in a certain way. I decide to push the red button instead of the green button. That decision, that conscious decision, which I think is free, can actually be traced to certain beliefs and desires I have. I believe that pushing the red button is desirable for a certain reason, okay? But why? Where do those beliefs and desires come from? It comes from certain kind of hormonal makeup. It's more complicated than that, the biological story, but a large part of it has to do with the makeup of our hormones. But our hormones were determined by what? By our adolescent development and the way that our prefrontal cortex was developed in the course of our adolescence, which was itself determined by our childhood development, because our childhood development affects our brain development in a very profound way. And what affects our childhood development? Well, a combination of our genes, our genetic makeup, the genes we're born with, and culture, our upbringing, the kind of parents that raised us and how they raised us and where we were raised, just the circumstances of our birth. But so you can ultimately trace everything back to some combination of nature and nurture, genes and culture, our upbringing and our environment, how we were raised, and so on. So this is roughly Sapolsky's story as to why we have absolutely no free will. Let me read you a passage to give you a flavor of his writing and his argumentation. He says, someone behaves in a particular way. Maybe it's wonderful and inspiring. Maybe it's appalling. Maybe it's in the eye of the beholder, or maybe just trivial. And we frequently ask the same basic question: why did that behavior occur? The answer is that the behavior happened because something that preceded it caused it to happen. And why did that prior circumstance occur? Because something that preceded it caused it to happen. It's antecedent causes all the way down. When you behave in a particular way, which is to say, when your brain has generated a particular behavior, it is because of the determinism that came just before, which was caused by the determinism just before that, and before that, all the way down. Okay. And as I said, he draws on a vast body of evidence from different fields, including neuroscience, genetics, evolutionary biology, and sociology, to substantiate his claim. But he makes some further arguments which are quite provocative and startling and worth reflecting on. He says, because we have no free will, nobody is actually morally responsible for their actions. Okay. Literally anybody. So people who are saints are not responsible for doing great and good things and inspiring saintly things. We shouldn't give them any credit. We shouldn't praise them. And people who do truly awful things, the Hitlers of the world and so on, they're off the hook too. We can't blame them. We can't say that that person is bad or evil, that they're bad for having done certain things. Can't say it. And he also says, Sapolsky, and Sam Harris too, that we would actually be better off as a society if we just abandoned belief in free will. It's actually harmful to us and unhelpful to believe that we have free will. It's because it's, at the end of the day, it's not true. And knowing the truth will actually set us free and make for a healthier society and healthier psychology of individuals. So we won't have guilt and shame and be judgmental toward other people. And then you might ask, well, then what about the justice system? What about punishment? What about jails, incarceration, and all that? He says, we'll still have jails, but the aim of jails is not retribution. It's not to punish somebody for having done something wrong, but deterrence. To prevent people from, those people who are committing crimes or doing bad things, from doing more harm to society. You can still do that, but you shouldn't judge them and say they're bad. That's what he's saying. The details are complicated. If you're interested, look at the book. It's called Determined. But I want to mention that obviously his arguments are extremely controversial, and there are many other thinkers, scholars, philosophers scientists who argue against his views. And one of the reviews of his book that came out shortly after it was published was by a philosopher named John Martin Fisher. And in his review in the LA Times, as far as I can tell, he makes two main arguments against Sapolsky's book. So Fisher's first argument is, he says, you're wrong, Sapolsky, that we don't have free will. Because what? Because I am capable of rational deliberation. And it's as a result of rational deliberation that I'm able to do things. And that rational deliberation itself is free. So let me quote to you from Fisher's article. He says, consider as a simple example my decision to sit down at my computer to write these sentences. Yes, my past in the laws of nature may have crucially led me here, but I did so also because of deliberation. I weighed the pros for writing against the cons and chose to do it. It wasn't like a sneeze. It was a process that involved reasoning. Determinism helps explain why I started typing, but it does not in itself rule out my free will. What's he saying? It's a little confusing, actually. I think it's not obvious what he's saying, but his basic argument seems to be that when I decide to do something like typing sentences on a keyboard, it's as a result of rational deliberation, and that rational deliberation itself is free. But I think Sapolsky has a pretty easy answer to this. He'll say, it's dogmatic to claim that your rational deliberation is free. That rational deliberation, which you think is free, in fact has prior causes and was determined by prior causes. All the stuff that he talks about in his 1,000-page book, all the different genetic and cultural factors leading to the beliefs and desires that result in your particular form of rational deliberation, which results in your typing those sentences on the page and writing the review of Sapolsky's book, right? So you don't give any good arguments, Sapolsky can say, for establishing that your rational deliberation is actually free. That seems to me to be a big problem with Fisher's response. And that goes for all the different kinds of things that we think that are a result of rational deliberation, rational self-control, like what? Spiritual practice. If we have an impulse to lose our temper, controlling our anger, controlling our temper, we think, yeah, that's, I tried really hard to prevent myself from flying off the handle. Aren't I great for that? Wasn't that free? Fisher's view is yes, that's a free decision. But Sapolsky says, no, even that is determined by prior causes. That decision to control your temper itself is not free, but actually determined by prior causes. And you can just map it out if you go far enough back. The second argument against Sapolsky's book that Fisher presents is that he says it's very disturbing and scary. Because Sapolsky says that moral responsibility basically flies out the window. And what kind of world would this be without moral responsibility, without people actually taking responsibility for what they do, good, bad, or otherwise? So let me read to you another part of Fisher's review. He says, the skeptical view, meaning Sapolsky's view that we have no free will, asks us to do what is almost humanly impossible, to let even our worst actors off the hook. Of course, the same point applies to good behavior. Heroes such as Sully Sullenberger would not deserve our gratitude, and your friend who sacrifices her plans so she can pick you up at LAX wouldn't merit it either. The skeptics offer a replacement for responsibility. We could still seek to rehabilitate or confine dangerous individuals. So now he's rehashing Sapolsky's argument here. We could still morally cajole and educate those who have hurt us. This kind of view, however, leaves out what is so difficult to deny, that some deeds and some people deserve blame and resentment, much as others deserve praise and gratitude. Some deserve our indignation and others our love. It is hard to imagine a richly textured and meaningful human life without moral responsibility, or free will for that matter. Here again, the argument seems to be, your argument is too scary, so I don't want to believe in it. I think, I mean, maybe I'm not being fair to Fisher here. Decide for yourself. You can read the review. As I said, it's in the LA Times. But as far as I can tell, Fisher's saying, without moral responsibility, then really terrible people are off the hook. And isn't that just terrible? And how can we live with ourselves and live in society in that way? And Sapolsky, I think, I can just imagine him saying, well, tough luck, or too bad. Life can be scary. But I think Sapolsky will also add, it's not as scary as you think. And a society in which we drop language of moral approval and disapproval and condemning people who do morally evil things is not necessarily such a scary society after all, because we're still going to put criminals behind bars, but in order to what? To rehabilitate them and to prevent them from causing further harm and so on. Okay, so the debate has been going on, but the point of this talk is not to just talk about current debates. This is more of a framing for what I want to talk about for the remainder of the talk, because after all, this is a Vedanta society. So the big question here is, what is the Vedantic approach to this age-long question of whether we have free will? And I want to focus specifically on a particular Vedantin named Sri Ramakrishna, who lived from 1836 to 1886. And I've done some scholarly work on his views on free will. So if you're interested, you can look at my article. It's called Hard Theological Determinism and the Illusion of Free Will. Sri Ramakrishna Meets Lord Kames, Saul Smolansky, and Dirk Pereboom, published in the Journal of World Philosophies in 2018. What I do there is summarize or really defend an interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will and determinism. And then I also bring him into dialogue with Western philosophers, whom I think come pretty close to his position. The three Western philosophers I focus on are Lord Kames, whom almost nobody has heard of, a Scottish philosopher, Saul Smolansky, and Dirk Pereboom. These two are contemporary philosophers who believe that we don't have any free will. So you can look at that, and a heads up on a new article that's going to come out sometime in 2025. Some of you might have heard of the philosopher Arindam Chakraborty. Have any of you heard of him? Yeah, a few people. So he's a very famous philosopher and a friend of mine. And because he's so famous, scholars are coming out with a book in appreciation of all the work he's done in his storied career as an academic philosopher. It's called a Festschrift. That's an academic term for a book that celebrates the work of a senior scholar who's made a lasting impact on the field. And so I've contributed a chapter to this Festschrift on Arindam Chakraborty's work, because he himself has written some interesting articles on Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's views on free will and determinism. And I have a kind of friendly debate with him about these articles of his. So you can check out that article in that book that should be coming out next year, which is almost this year, or in a few weeks. That article is called From Karmic Determinism to Divine Freedom, revisiting Swami Vivekananda's views on free will and determinism. Okay, so I'm going to be summarizing in a very simple and hopefully non-technical way what I write about in those articles, especially that first article on Sri Ramakrishna. So, coming to Sri Ramakrishna, when you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and you study his teachings, and you think about this issue of free will, I think many people are confronted with a puzzle or a dilemma, because on the one hand, one of the keynotes in the gospel is God alone is a doer. God alone is a doer. I am a mere instrument in mother's hands, and so on. This comes up again and again. It was one of his favorite songs by Ram Prasad. Ami jontro, tumi jontri. At the same time, he's constantly encouraging people to engage in spiritual practice, to renounce lust and greed, to pray. All of these things that he's recommending seem to presuppose the ability to actually do those things in a free manner, right? Why would he tell us to do things that if he knows that we can't do them, right? So it's a little bit of a puzzle. And quite a few visitors who came to Sri Ramakrishna expressed this puzzlement and asked him about it. And so he gave a very explicit answer. And he gives, I think, a really interesting and novel and philosophically sophisticated way to reconcile free will and determinism. And I think that he deserves a place at the philosophical table, actually. He should be arguing with the Sapolskys and Sam Harrises of the world and the Fishers of the world. So on January 5th, 1884, somebody asks him about free will, and he gives a very succinct answer, which I think captures his views, almost his complete view in a nutshell. He says, "It is God alone who does everything. You may say that in that case one may commit sin, but that is not true. If a person is firmly convinced that God alone is the doer and that he himself is nothing, then he will never make a false step. It is God alone who has planted in our mind what the Englishmen call free will." This is quite interesting. British colonial India, right? Shadhin Icha. This is the Bengali term, Swadhina Icha, for free will. It is God alone who has planted in our minds what the Englishmen call free will. People who have not realized God would become engaged in more and more sinful action if God had not planted in them the notion of free will. Sin would have increased if God had not made the sinner feel that he alone was responsible for his sin. Those who have realized God are aware that free will is a false appearance. In reality, I am the machine and God is the operator. Bostuto tini jontri, ami jontro. I am the carriage and God is the driver. Okay, so what is this view that he's expressing? I think it's called in technical philosophy theological determinism. Okay, determinism means we don't have any free will, that everything we do is determined by prior causes. Theological determinism says something in addition to that. Theological determinism is a view that God is the ultimate cause of everything that we're doing and that we've ever done in the past and that we'll ever do in the future. If you trace that chain of prior causes far back enough, you end up with God. Okay, that's theological determinism. So Sapolsky, Sam Harris are determinists. They don't believe in free will, but they're not theological determinists because they're either atheist or agnostic. I think Sapolsky is an atheist. Sam Harris is either atheist or agnostic. But they're not theological determinists. Sri Ramakrishna is a theological determinist. So he'll agree with Sapolsky and Sam Harris about their determinism, but say that you're wrong in not positing God as the ultimate cause of everything we do, right? Okay, but that's not his complete position. So there's a lot more to his argument. I want to kind of develop that a little bit and explain it. So the next question, well, it's great that he believes that, but how do we know it's true? What evidence do we have? What good reasons do we have for believing in theological determinism, that God alone is the doer? And in fact, this comes up in the course of a conversation between a modern Western-educated doctor named Dr. Shorkad, a homeopathic doctor, and Girish Ghosh, one of the great devotees of Sri Ramakrishna. They're debating about free will. And Dr. Shorkad, well, no, Sri Ramakrishna prompts the debate between these two guys. Sri Ramakrishna says everything is determined by God's will. We have no free will. Dr. Shorkad is a bit troubled by that. And so he says, but God has given us free will. I can think of God or not as I like. And then Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna doesn't respond. Girish Ghosh responds to Dr. Shorkad. Girish Ghosh says to Dr. Shorkad, you think of God or do some good work because you like to. Really, it is not you who do these things, but your liking of them that makes you do so. Okay, so Girish Ghosh's position is, you think you're free to do the things you're doing, like doing your homeopathic practice and whatever. In fact, it's because you like to do those things. So it's your desire to engage in homeopathy that's causing you to engage in homeopathy. And that desire itself has other prior causes. And so ultimately, you're not free. Sri Ramakrishna intervenes at this point in the debate. And he says the following, supporting Girish Ghosh's position that we have no free will. He says, in order to do anything, One must have a belief about something and feel joy at the thought of what he believes. Only then does he set about performing the work. Suppose a jar of gold coins is hidden underground. First of all, a man must have the knowledge or belief that the jar of gold coins is there. He also feels joy at the thought of the jar. Then he begins to dig. As he removes the earth, he hears a metallic sound. That increases his joy. Next, he sees a corner of the jar. That gives him more joy. Thus, his joy is ever on the increase. So what is he saying in his own simple way? Pretty much what Girish Ghosh is telling Dr. Sarkar, which is that everything we're doing, everything we think, which we think is free, is in fact determined by certain sets of beliefs and desires, right? I desire something and I believe that by doing X, I'll fulfill that desire. And those beliefs and desires themselves can be traced back to prior causes, which ultimately can be traced back to God. This is Sri Ramakrishna's argument. And I think that Sri Ramakrishna would be very happy and would welcome the arguments of Sapolsky and Sam Harris, proving that our beliefs and desires are what are determining our actions, our behavior. And I think it fully supports Sri Ramakrishna's position, except that they're not going to support the ultimate claim that God is the ultimate cause of what we do. For that, we need spiritual experience, because that's another part of Sri Ramakrishna's argument, which is that I know that God is a doer, he says, because I've realized that Mother alone is doing everything, and I'm a mere instrument, right? And then you get into this tricky philosophical question of, well, why should we accept that he had a genuine spiritual experience? What if it's just a hallucination? It's a very complicated philosophical question, and I've given separate talks on this, and I've written 2-3 chapters of books devoted to this question. So if you're interested, you can look at chapters 4 through 6 of my book published in 2022 called Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism, published by Oxford University Press. You can ask me in the Q&A or something if you want, but it gets really complicated. But anyway, there are actually good philosophical arguments as to why we should accept the testimony of mystics who claim to have experienced supersensuous realities like God. Okay. So, another thing, important aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's view. He says something really interesting, that passage that I read to you earlier. He says, if God had not implanted in us the illusion of free will, we would have committed much more sin than we're already committing. We're already committing sin. We know that. We can open a newspaper and see that, or watch the news. But it would have been a much worse situation if we didn't have the illusion of free will. So this is another really important part of his position. Number one, we have no free will. God alone is a doer. But number two, we think we have free will. We are under the illusion that we are free. And God herself, in her infinite wisdom, has implanted in us this illusion of free will for our own good and for the good of society. Because if we didn't have that illusion of free will, we would be doing a lot more bad things than we're already doing. Okay, so this is another important part of his position. We're hardwired in such a way that we can't help but feel that we're actually free and therefore morally responsible for our actions. And so when we do something bad, we feel guilty. And sometimes we even beat ourselves up about it, right? We do something good. Oh, I did something good, or somebody else did something good, and we praise them. This is all kind of hardwired into us. And that hardwiring is good. It's good for society and good for ourselves. Okay, this is something where Sapolsky and Sam Harris kind of differ, because they seem to think that it's better that we know the truth, that there's no free will. I think Sri Ramakrishna will agree with Fisher actually on this point, that it would be a scary society if people didn't believe that they're free. Okay, and actually in one place in the gospel, he actually spells out the harmful social consequences of not believing in free will. He says, as long as a person has not realized God, that person thinks she is free. It is God herself who keeps this error in human beings. Otherwise, sin would have multiplied. People would not have been afraid of sin. There would have been no punishment for it. There would have been no punishment for it. So this is really the scenario that Sapolsky is sketching in a way. There's still punishment, but it's not, he wouldn't use the language of punishment. It's about rehabilitation and deterrence. Sri Ramakrishna is saying that's very dangerous. it will throw into question all sorts of cherished beliefs about our freedom and our moral responsibility and good and bad, which is not going to help people in making moral and spiritual progress, and it might even hurt them. So what Sri Ramakrishna says is, so you might think this is already something paradoxical going on here. He's saying we have no free will, and yet it's really important to believe in free will. It's not a paradox. The idea is we're not actually free, but we're hardwired in such a way as to feel that we're free. And that feeling that we're free is good enough to feel morally responsible for our actions, which is necessary for us to engage in day-to-day life and for society to flourish and thrive. Basically, that's the idea. We don't actually have free will, but we have the feeling of free will. And because of that feeling of free will, we have the feeling of moral responsibility, even though we're not actually morally responsible for our actions. And that feeling of moral responsibility is what prompts us to engage in spiritual practice, what prompts us to do good things, what prompts us to feel bad when we do bad things. And that's also what makes us feel a bad conscience when we do bad things. All that is based on this feeling of free will and the feeling of moral responsibility, even if we don't have any free will. Okay? Now, a twist here, not a twist, but Robert Sapolsky, remember this guy who says, I don't believe in free will. He says something really interesting in his book. He says, Sapolsky says, I haven't believed in free will since adolescence. And it's been a moral imperative for me to view humans without judgment or the belief that anyone deserves anything special, to live without a capacity for hatred or entitlement. And I just can't do it. Sure, sometimes I can sort of get there, but it is rare that my immediate response to events aligns with what I think is the only acceptable way to understand human behavior. Instead, I usually fail dismally. This is really interesting. Since he was a teenager, he's believed that we have no free will. And then he becomes a neurobiologist, and he actually tries to prove it based on a vast array of scientific evidence. And now he's very strongly convinced that we have no free will and that he's not free and that nobody is free. And yet he can't help but feel that he is free when he gets up out of bed, when he goes to Stanford and writes his books and gives his lectures. He can't help but express moral approval for those who are nice to him and do good things in the world. He can't help but feel moral disapproval toward people who do bad things to his loved ones and to himself. And Sri Ramakrishna will laugh and say, yeah, exactly. Right? Because God, Divine Mother, has hardwired us in this way. Even people writing giant tomes proving that we have no free will still feel that they're free. And he can't help it. Now, here there's an interesting divergence in opinion, in views and feelings, because I listened to a podcast recently, a debate, not a debate, actually. Actually, that's one of the things that irritated me about this podcast. The podcast is Sam Harris's, and he invited Robert Sapolsky to talk about free will. And it was more of a love fest, unfortunately. I don't like love fests. I like argument and debate. And I feel like, because the two of them are kind of, they see, their positions are too aligned. And I think they should have invited a third person who had a completely different view, but they didn't. Like a Fisher or somebody representing Ramakrishna or something. So it was really a love fest, but they disagreed on one relatively minor issue. They both believe there's no free will, but they had a really interesting chat about whether they actually feel that they don't have free will. And Sapolsky, as I just pointed out, says, I can't feel that I'm not free. The moment I get out of bed and I start writing my book or whatever, I feel I'm free again. Sam Harris claims that he actually, in his day-to-day life, he feels that he's not free. Like he doesn't act as if he is free. He feels that he's not free. Whether you want to believe him or not is up to you. He does have a decades-long meditation practice. I'm a little skeptical, to be honest. And I think that if it's true, then he has to have attained enlightenment. And I don't know whether he claims that he's enlightened or not, but anyway, I'll leave that up to you. But he seems to think, yeah, I live life as if I have no free will. And I really believe that we don't have free will. Suppose he says, I believe that we don't have free will, and yet I can't act on that belief. I still feel that I'm free. Okay. And you can ask yourselves, just introspect and ask, You know, can I live in such a way that I just, I feel that I'm not free, that I'm actually determined that God alone is a doer? And Sri Ramakrishna will say, no, you can't until you've realized God. So he distinguishes standpoints. He says, the agyani, the person who is unenlightened, the person who has not yet realized God, cannot help but feel that he or she is free. Can't help it. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many Sapolsky's books and podcasts by Sam Harris and this and that, and no matter how much you convince yourself that we're not free, still, the moment you get off your chair, you're going to think you're free again. This is Ramakrishna's position. I'm inclined to agree with it, but I'm biased, of course. Then he says, there's another standpoint. Now imagine that you've realized God. You're a Jivan Mukta. You're liberated while still in the human body. Now what do you believe? Now what do you feel? He says the Jivan Mukta, the person who has realized God, now knows that God alone is a doer. In fact, he defines the Jivan Mukta in this way. In several places in the Gospel, he says, the Jivan Mukta is the one who knows that God alone is a doer, and that I am a mere instrument in the hands of God. This is what the Jivan Mukta feels. So it's the Jivan Mukta, the God-realized soul, the person who has attained enlightenment, that alone can feel that he or she is not free. Okay? And then another question comes up, which is, well, then can't the Jivan Mukta do whatever he or she wants and get away with it, even bad things? Theoretically, yes, but in practice, no. Why? Because they've completely wiped out all ego and selfishness. So they can never take a false step. That's Sri Ramakrishna's view. Right? So once you've attained enlightenment, even though you could theoretically do something bad and say, well, it's not me that's doing it, it's God that's doing it, you can't. Because you've wiped out all of your unwholesome, unethical samskaras, your latent mental impressions. You've realized God, and God will never make you do anything bad. I want to mention here something that comes up a lot when I talk about free will in the context of Ramakrishna, which is this, that some of you may have actually carried out this experiment. Go ahead and ask a monk, let's say not him because he's already biased by listening to my talk, but ask Sarvadevanandaji or someone else, Maharaj, do we have free will? And see what they say in response. I can almost guarantee you 9 times out of 10, most Ramakrishna monks will give the following answer. They'll say, we have a little free will. We have limited free will. It's like this. Imagine a cow tied to a post and there's a rope of, let's say, like 10 feet. The cow is free to roam within that 10-foot radius, but can't go beyond that. So we have limited free will. I've heard this from many, many monks. I heard this from day one of my joining. And then I did my own investigation, and I found the reason for this as the standard response, but I think it's wrong. We have 2 main source books on this issue. One is Swami Sharadananda's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, the Leela Prasanga, Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play, translated by Swami Chetanandaji. And we also have the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, written by M. The analogy of the cow tied to a post comes up in both places in the context of free will. So let's look at these 2 places. First of all, in the Gospel, October 26th, 1885, Dr. Sharkar, the same Dr. Sharkar, the homeopathic doctor, is now debating with M about free will. So he loved debating, and he's debating with them now. Dr. Sharkar, I do not say that the will is absolutely free. Suppose a cow is tied with a rope. She is free within a length of that rope. But when she feels the pull of the rope, Sri Ramakrishna interrupts him. Judu Mullik also gave that illustration. Is it mentioned in some English book? Look here. If a person truly believes that God alone does everything, that she is the operator and human beings the machine, then such a person is a Jivan Mukta, one who has achieved liberation while living. Thou workest thine own work, people only call it theirs. He's quoting from a Ram Prasad Sam. This is not an analogy endorsed by Sri Ramakrishna. He says, where'd you find it? An English textbook? This is, again, British colonial India, so taught by British people. Swami Medhananda was a philosophy major at Scottish Church College, and he was taught by Scottish and British philosophers, right? So Sri Ramakrishna is wondering, did you get this from some kind of English textbook? But things get more complicated because a few months later, he shifted to Kashipur, the garden house where he spends his last few months because he's suffering from throat cancer. There, his future monastic disciples, Swami Sharadananda, the author of this biography, and others are debating with another future monastic disciple named Niranjanananda about free will in the presence of Sri Ramakrishna. Do we have free will or not? And Sharadananda is writing as follows. This is how Sri Ramakrishna intervenes in this debate. He says, is there any free will for anyone? Everything is happening and will happen eternally by God's will. People understand this eventually. So at least let me pause there for a second. It seems like he's endorsing this theological determinism position. God, we think we have free will, but in fact we have no free will. But then it gets a little complicated. He says, let me give you an example. Here's a cow tied to a post with a long tether. She can walk 1 cubit from the post or up to the whole length of the tether. A human being's free will is also like that. God has given some power to human beings and has also given them the freedom to use it as they wish. That is why people think they are free. I think this is a tricky passage, and I can see why many people, after reading this passage, come away feeling that Sri Ramakrishna is using this cow and post analogy to prove that we have, or to demonstrate or illustrate that we have limited free will. We don't have unfettered free will, but we have limited free will. But I think that we need to interpret this passage in the context of what he says about it a couple months earlier in the gospel, where he says, this analogy is also not true from the ultimate standpoint. From the highest standpoint, God alone is a doer. And I think that what he's suggesting is that for some spiritual aspirants, it's helpful to believe in this cow post analogy. He says, look, if it helps you as a spiritual aspirant, you shouldn't believe in absolute free will because that's just wrong. But believe in limited free will as a kind of provisional position until you realize God. If the idea that we have no free will is just too scary for you to take. This is my take on why he himself uses that cow post analogy that he was questioning just a few months earlier. I think he thinks that it might be useful to some aspirants. And in fact, I've given talks on free will in other centers. And invariably, there are a few people who, after hearing the talk, kind of get a little concerned. Like, what do we do then? And they start freaking out a little bit. And so I think Sri Ramakrishna, for those people, will say, then think about the cow and the post. You've got limited free will. You can roam within a certain radius, but you can't go beyond that. And then when you realize God, you realize even that little radius that we thought that we were free to roam within, that itself was also God's will. That also is not our will at all. So we didn't even have limited free will. Okay. So anyway, it's quite interesting that in our tradition, there's this cow and the post and in these two different texts, and I'll let you decide how to interpret the cow and the post. Now, there's another problem that arises in this context, in the context of Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will. It's what I would call the problem of colliding standpoints. Sri Ramakrishna, at this point, there's a third standpoint, but I don't want to ruin the suspense, so I'll get to that in a second. But so far, I've introduced two standpoints. One is a standpoint of the unenlightened person, the agyani, who thinks that he's free, but in reality is not free. Second standpoint, the standpoint of the Jivan Mukta, the enlightened person who has realized God, who knows that God alone is a doer, right? But now, what happens if an enlightened person tells an unenlightened person that he or she is not free? You know, you think you're free, oh, unenlightened person, but in fact, it's not true. It's a lie. What happens? What will that person do? How will that person behave? And in fact, somebody asked Sri Ramakrishna this question on a particular occasion. A Brahma follower, a follower of the Brahma Samaj, says, if it is God that makes me do everything, then I'm not responsible for my sins. And this person is pretty clearly unenlightened at this point. He's a spiritual aspirant, but not yet. He hasn't yet realized God. So Sri Ramakrishna says, with a smile, yes, Duryodhana also said that. He's quoting from the Mahabharata. O Krishna, I do what thou seated in my heart makest me do. If a man has the firm conviction that God alone is the doer and he is his instrument, then he cannot do anything sinful. He who has learned to dance correctly never makes a false step. One cannot even believe in the existence of God until one's heart becomes pure. It's a very startling statement. The last statement, you can't even believe in God until your heart becomes pure, let alone believing that God alone is a doer. That requires nothing short of God realization. To really believe, to truly believe that God alone is a doer and that we have no free will, you have to have realized God. And so he's going to quibble with Sapolsky here, I think, because Sapolsky says, remember that passage I read, I believe that we have no free will, and yet I can't help but feel that I have free will. Sri Ramakrishna will say, you think you believe that you don't have free will, but in fact you don't. Because if you really believe that you don't have free will, you would act accordingly. And just imagine, I'm walking across the street. Suddenly I see a giant truck coming towards me. And I believe that there's a giant truck coming towards me. What'll I do? Will I sit there and stand there on the road? No. If I don't have a death wish. What'll I do? I'll jump out of the way. If I really believe that a giant truck is about to kill me, then wouldn't I get out of the way? Likewise, Sri Ramakrishna will say, if you really believe that God alone is the doer, then you would behave completely differently. You would live as if there's no free will. You would know that there's no free will, and you would act accordingly. You can't have a belief and then believe one particular belief and then act in the opposite way. That's not the way that beliefs work. Okay. Okay. Now, I finally get to this third standpoint. So first standpoint, the unenlightened person who thinks he's free but isn't. Second standpoint, the enlightened person who's realized God and knows that God alone is a doer and that he is a mere instrument in God's hands. But there's an interesting twist to this whole story. This is why I called this talk Reconciling Free Will and Determinism. Because in the end, Sri Ramakrishna comes back to free will. It's really interesting. How does he get back to free will? After all this, I just gave a whole talk on how we have no free will. How does he get back to free will? Because God alone is a truly free being. And from the highest spiritual standpoint, which he calls the standpoint of vijnana, there's nothing but God. Every single one of us here, sitting here today, I'm speaking to you today, we're just God in different forms. God is playfully manifesting as you, as you, as you, as you, as you. And so to the extent that we can identify with God, to the extent that we can align our consciousness with divine consciousness, to that extent we are free. And when we become a vijnani, we directly inherit God's free will. God alone is free. We're not free as body-mind complexes, but God is free, using us as his instruments. But if we can identify with God, then we are free. You see the twist here? So it's very profound. And it's also very consoling and reassuring in the end, that in fact we actually do have free will in the end. But as God, as body-mind complexes, never and no free will. As God, we have perfect free will. And it's just a matter of realizing that we're God. This is similar to Kashmiri Shaivism. If any of you are familiar with Kashmiri Shaivism, there's nothing but Shiva. Each one of us is Shiva, and we suffer because we don't know it. And so the whole aim of all spiritual practice in Kashmiri Shaivism is to achieve what's called, what Abhinavagupta and what others Kashmiri Shaivites call pratyabhigya, which means recognition. Recognition of what we truly are. I need to realize that I'm actually not Swami Medhananda. I'm Shiva playing the role of Swami Medhananda. You see, when you realize that, you inherit Shiva's freedom. So it's actually similar in some ways to the Kashmiri Shaivite position. Audinam Chakraborty, that same philosopher that I was talking about earlier, he's fond of saying this about, he loves Sri Ramakrishna, and he would say, if you want to understand Sri Ramakrishna's teachings properly, better to study Kashmiri Shaivism than to study Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, because Sri Ramakrishna's teachings come so much closer to Kashmiri Shaivism than to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta, for a few reasons. Number one, because Sri Ramakrishna teaches again and again, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. He accepts the equal reality of non-dual Brahman and Shakti, which Shankara doesn't. And secondly, because of the status of this world, because Shankara says at the end of the day that this world is an illusory appearance. It's like an illusory snake superimposed upon a rope, which alone is real. And Sri Ramakrishna says the Vijnani sees that this entire world is a mansion of mirth. It's a mart of joy. It's a real manifestation of Shakti, of Divine Mother. You see all names and forms as blissful manifestations of Divine Mother. Okay. Finally, just to wrap things up, we have just a couple minutes. There are a couple things I could do here. I could talk about the Gita, but maybe if you're interested in how this relates to the Gita's views on free will, feel free to ask me that in the Q&A. I'm going to skip that just because we have limited time. And so what I want to end with is briefly talking about how any of this is relevant to us, because we've just been talking a lot about very heavy philosophical issues. Some of us might be confused or frightened. How does it help us as spiritual aspirants to know that, well, to distinguish these three standpoints, first of all, to know Sri Ramakrishna's views on free will, right? Presumably most of us haven't yet realized God. And so what do we do? And how do his views, how do his teachings help us? First of all, don't freak out. That's the first thing to take away here. I don't want you to come away feeling, well, now we have no free will, so what do I do? And you become hopeless and despondent. No, that's not the point. And Sri Ramakrishna will add, even if you go and you get a little depressed for a little while, you can't help but feel that you're free anyway. So you're still gonna get up out of bed and then. So what's the idea? The idea is you should live as if you're free because you can't help but feel that you're free. And God has wisely given us this illusion of free will for a good reason, so that we can engage in spiritual practices, so that we can become better people, so that we can try to eliminate selfishness and egoism, and ultimately realize God. Okay. That's why somebody asked him at one point, they say, "Sir, is it not then in human hands to practice sadhana, spiritual disciplines, if we don't have free will? A person might simply say, whatever I do is according to God's will." And then Sri Ramakrishna says, "What good does it do to say that? One may say there is no thorn, no pricking, but one still cries out when one's hand is pricked by a thorn." So at the end of the day, you can't help but feel that you're free. That's a sufficient basis for your spiritual practices. But I want to also emphasize a deeper point here. Why does he keep emphasizing that God alone is a doer to people that he knows can't live as if God is a doer because they're not realized? Why? Why does he say it? I think there's a deeper point about sadhana here. Sri Ramakrishna would often distinguish two paradigms of spiritual practice. One is the baby monkey paradigm. The other is the baby kitten. The baby monkey is the one who's holding on for dear life to mother monkey. As the mother monkey, it hops from tree to tree. What happens if that baby monkey lets go of its grip? It gets dashed to the ground and killed. This is the paradigm of self-effort, purushakara, in spiritual practice. I'm the doer. I'm responsible for everything I'm doing. You know, it's good in a way to have some degree of self-effort, but it can be taken to an extreme. And so the baby monkey is the extreme self-effort paradigm. At the other extreme lies the baby kitten paradigm. There's a baby kitten. All it does is say mew, mew. And the mother cat will just pick it up with its mouth and plop it anywhere it wants. Sometimes in the gutter, other times in a palace. And the baby kitten is the least bothered about what mother cat does with it. Why? Because baby kitten is perfectly content having surrendered to mother. Mother knows best. This is the paradigm of total self-surrender, feeling that God alone is a doer. And all we do is mew and mew, right? So I think what Sri Ramakrishna is suggesting is, in spiritual life, it's beneficial for us to gradually try to move away from the baby monkey paradigm to the baby kitten paradigm. For almost all of us, it's helpful. And these teachings that God alone is a doer, that I'm a mere instrument in her hands, these kind of help us to kind of be more of the baby kitten and to channel that baby kitten, that inner baby kitten within us, and to try to be more self-surrendered, less reliant on our own self-effort, which at the end of the day is not very much. And in the end, we'll realize that also is God's grace. That's why Sri Ramakrishna would say, the breeze, the gentle breeze of God's grace is always blowing. But we have to take advantage of that by setting the sail, right, in the right direction so that we can take advantage of God's grace. So that's the attitude we should have as spiritual aspirants. We can't fully believe that God alone is a doer, but we can start moving away from the baby monkey paradigm to the baby kitten paradigm. We need a little bit of both the baby monkey and the baby kitten until we realize God. But when we realize God, we just say mew, mew. Thank you. Oh, so we just do that now. Okay. Yeah. All right. Q&A. Questions? Yeah.
Just so wait for a microphone and then ask a question. Mahabharata, Draupadi talked to Yudhishthira.
Oh, Draupadi. Yeah.
That some person told her that what happens because of prarabdha karma, effort, and devata, or natural stuff.
Yeah.
And by chance. And if there is no free will, how we can do some effort, which suppose some willpower.
Yeah.
And if this willpower comes from ahankara or come from the atma?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So the thing is, Hinduism is vast, and there are many different texts. You just quoted from Mahabharata, right? And among Hindu thinkers, many different Hindu thinkers have different views on this question of whether we have free will. And for the whole talk, I gave you one view, one Hindu thinker's view, which is Sri Ramakrishna's. And other Hindu thinkers have very different views. Some Hindu thinkers believe that we have some free will. Others think we have total free will. So it runs the whole range. Actually, at the extreme on which Sri Ramakrishna lies, there are people like Nisargadatta Maharaj. Some of you, I'm sure, have read I Am That. And in one place in I Am That, somebody asks him point blank, do we have free will? And then he looks at them like really puzzled and he says, there's no such thing as free will in Hinduism. So you should know that. So anyway, but that's not actually, I mean, there actually are some Hindu traditions that believe in some limited free will. And the passage you quote from the Mahabharata seems to suggest some degree of free will, but I don't think that's Sri Ramakrishna's position. Thank you. Other questions?
Swami, maybe you can elaborate. There may be two paths. One more the path towards the impersonal aspect of the divine, so the traditional Gyanis, and the path are more bhaktas who think of the more approach of the personal. So the path of the Gyanis, they probably subscribe more towards a realm of that this universe is a cause and effect relationship, and they subscribe more towards not God's free will, but more towards cause and effect. And the other flip side is from the devotional point of view, you have more God's grace. So could you see it as like there's two approaches? One may emphasize this karmic, and the other may emphasize God's grace.
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Ramakrishna reconciles, but I'm saying from a traditional point of view, the devotee, it's all about God's grace. Everything's happening to God's will.
Yeah.
So as opposed to the Jnani.
I get it. The only wrench I'd throw into that is that the Jnani, right, who's presumably a follower of Shankara, for instance, because they distinguish two standpoints as well, right? This world, seeing this world of names and forms and cause and effect that you're talking about, all falls within the Vyavaharika realm, the empirical standpoint. But what also falls within that Vyavaharika standpoint? Ishvara, God. So to the extent that we're in the dream, God is also part of that dream. And so I don't think Shankara or anybody would have any problem with saying that God alone is a doer as well. With the caveat that that's because we're dumb and we haven't realized Brahman yet. Right. But when we realize the highest truth, that we're nothing but non-dual pure consciousness, then the whole dream breaks. God goes away, so does cause and effect. And then there's just non-dual pure consciousness and there's no world. But so long as you're in the world, because you're ignorant, then I think you can accept God as well. And in fact, even Shankara says in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, he says, you cannot attain jnana without the grace of God. Many people don't know that. But he says, Ishvara Prasada, he says that you cannot attain the knowledge of non-dual Brahman without the grace of God. That's true from the empirical standpoint. And from the highest standpoint, no God, no grace, right? It's a difference between being in a dream and lucidly dreaming, knowing that you're the dreamer, right? And waking up from the dream.
But in the
ultimately, you wake up from the dream, then there's no God. Yeah.
Right. But in the path of sadhana, the emphasis is more on identity. I am that. Here you're not so much focused on the aspect of God. In the personal, it's about a relationship. So, so I don't know. It seems to me that when you talk about the path of Jnana Marga, the path of it's more the emphasis. This world is going on in its own personal way. There's a cause effect that's created by.
I still think you're thinking more of Neo-Advaita. Like if you go back to Shankara, he's always talking about God, and he's talking about God as karma phala data, and he talks about it all the time in the commentary and the Brahma Sutra. And I think there's a difference between Neo-Advaitans and most of them don't even read Shankara, especially in the original Sanskrit, and that's part of the problem, is because they go away with weird ideas about. But Shankara clearly and emphatically talks about God all the time.
Ultimately
And
true, you're right, it's God's grace.
Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
yeah. But it's still,
Emphasis.
yeah.
Shift of emphasis.
I think that's true. Yeah, yeah. But again, I do think you raise an interesting issue, which is this. I think there's a discrepancy between the way the Neo-Advaitins think about the path of knowledge and the way that Shankara himself did. I've had arguments with Sarvapriyanji about this, actually. It's quite interesting. Yeah. Yes. Oh, and you also had a question. Yeah, yeah.
In reference to that, you were saying that the analogy, the cow tethered to a pole, limited free will and free will. I don't know if this applies, but in complete works of Swami Vivekananda, he mentioned that we don't move from a falsehood to truth. We move from lower truth to higher truth.
Yeah.
So can it be applied that the pole and cow analogy is like a lower truth?
Yeah, exactly.
And the higher truth is like we actually have no free will.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was suggesting. Exactly. That's a nice way of putting it. It's a kind of lower truth or a provisional standpoint that might be beneficial to certain sadhakas, certain spiritual aspirants. I believe that we have limited free will, but it's like Sri Ramakrishna will also use the analogy of thorns. If you have a thorn in your foot, you remove it with a second thorn, but then you throw away both the thorns. And so one of the cow post could be like a second thorn. Thank you. Very good. Yeah. Who's next? Yeah, somebody should moderate and like look at the order of people raising their hands so that nobody's left out. Yeah. After him, in front of you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So last year I had the pleasure of taking a course with John Fisher. Titled
At UC Riverside, right? Yeah.
Metaphysics of Free Will. And I remember being in this class and feeling very unsatisfied with all the arguments on both sides. And the reason for my dissatisfaction was that I felt like all of these arguments are assuming that time is constructed linearly, that there's a fixed past which leads to a present moment, and there's either a fixed future or a potential future that we can hypothesize. And I even brought this up with John Fisher, asking like, well, what if we perceive reality as an eternal present? Or what if we perceive reality or time as cyclical? He rejected these ideas and just affirmed the linearity of time. But I wasn't satisfied because I just felt like that was an assumption. So I was wondering if there's a different perspective. Like, what does karma say about time? How is time constructed in relation to karma?
That's really interesting. And the fact that you took a class with John Fisher about free will and all that. Yeah. So I still see Sri Ramakrishna as saying that this linearity of time, that we have a kind of past and that we have a future and that we're in the present, is part of Mother's Leela. I think it's part of the rules of this cosmic play that we're in. And so I still think it's relevant. There's the view of creation is different from like the Christian view, because it's cyclical in this sense that right now we're in the manifest state. The universe is a manifest state, and so we see names and forms. But that at some point there's going to be something like a big crunch, and then everything will collapse into like a little seed state. And everything will still be there in a latent form. It's kind of like an egg with a yolk, right? And then again, it's going to eventually expand. So it's expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. But that's still within linear time. That's the way I see it. And then when you attain liberation, you're liberated from this whole bondage of the linearity of time. You see? And so you can, if you're a Jivan Mukta, you can inhabit both standpoints. You can see the play of the linearity of time while also being beyond time. And so when a bhakta attains liberation, what do they want? They want to eat sugar. They don't want to become sugar. And so they dwell in an eternal heaven. A devotee of Ramakrishna will be in Ramakrishna Loka. A devotee of Krishna will be in Goloka or Vrindavana. And there's no time, there's no linear time. If there was linear, this is really interesting, because some people who, especially Neo-Advaitins and Advaitins and whatever, when you talk about heaven, they're like, boring. I'll get bored. That boredom comes from the linearity of time. It's like, the longer you are in heaven, the more you start looking at your watch, like, all right, these bhajans are fun and all, but like, come on, let's moving on. I want non-dual pure consciousness. No, but the point is, in heaven, we don't have that sense of time because you've transcended time. And that linearity of time is what gives us boredom, right? 1 second after that, and then followed by the next second, and then followed by the next second. That's not the way somebody feels who's a liberated jiva in these higher lokas. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the gentleman in front of you had a question. Okay, fine, good.
So you mentioned that each of us have limited amount of free will. Right? So
I don't think that's the ultimate position.
I know, but
okay.
Assuming that there's a limited amount of free will.
Okay,
right?
if we assume that there is a limited free will, which I don't, yeah.
So how can we stretch it? How can we increase the length of the rope?
Right, right.
That's what I was just thinking about when you mentioned that.
Right. Okay. So first of all, the clarification is I don't believe we have limited free will. I believe we have no free will, but I don't believe it because I'm not realized. So, okay. Intellectually, I'm being very careful here, that we don't have free will, even though I can't really believe it until I've realized God. But the question you're asking is, if as a spiritual aspirant, it's helpful for us to believe that we have limited free will, how do we increase the length of that rope? Is it even worth trying to increase the length of the rope or to work within the radius that we're given and to do our best within that radius? I think that would be the better approach. Do the best that you can do within that radius, and then God will leave it up to God, and God might lengthen the rope of that, the length of that rope. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
This is a question from a person who believes that they have free will.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know I'm deluded, but I'm happy to be deluded in
Right,
belief
correct.
that I have
Mm-hmm.
free will.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a practice I do that gives me that power, and I share it with you, and then you tell me what you think of it.
Mm-hmm.
What I try to do is to be loving, kind, and happy. And if I do that, I notice I have to have freedom of choice, because everything is opposing that. Society, biology, time, space fluctuations, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, whatever works for you. So you should stick with whatever works. But I would say that goodness, that what are the other words you used? Positivity or love, kind,
and happy.
Yeah, like another way of explaining that is it's by God's grace that it's God's gift to me that I'm able to express this goodness and this love. And so it doesn't necessarily presuppose free will, but if that works for you, then that's great. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Hi. The way I tend to think of things in paradigms, and let me start first with I've talked with a lot of swamis about free will. And
Yeah.
always bring up
The cow in the post. I told you 9 times out of 10, cow in the post.
The problem I see with it is that they seem to think that when you finally get to having no free will, it's only when you are one with the absolute.
You mean Advait in a classical
Yeah.
Advaitic sense?
And
I see no evidence for that in the gospel, but yeah.
because once you're down in the world,
Mm-hmm.
then isn't okay.
I'd say when you realize that God alone is a doer is when you're Jivan Mukta, when you realize God. But that's not, Sri Ramakrishna doesn't define the Jivan Mukta in terms of classical Advaita. That's what's interesting.
Right,
He says
right.
the Jivan Mukta is the one who knows that God alone is the doer.
But I think many of the swamis do
Do what?
define enlightenment according to.
I know, it's because of training center, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
my question is really about. I see the two ways of looking at things, two paradigms, as whether the person is totally in avidya-maya,
Mm-hmm.
and
The Maya of ignorance, that's avidya Maya, yeah.
and that is where their mind is, and
Right,
they can't help
right,
that.
right.
And they're going to be totally into their own free will because that's Maya imposing that on them.
Yeah, they think that they're free, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And those who are in Vijaya can see it's all Mother doing it all.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question.
Oh,
here-
well, can I correct you there?
Okay.
I don't think that's quite right. Avidya Maya, the Maya of ignorance, are all the lower selfish impulses, and we're driven by those things like lust and anger and greed and whatever. So yeah, we think we're free, but we're not. We're driven by those impulses, which themselves are prior causes and blah, blah, blah. But even Vidya Maya, I think, falls under no free will. You don't, Vidyamaya are things like, Sri Ramakrishna will give examples, like dispassion, like detachment, bhakti, devotion, all those things, but we haven't yet realized God. That's like the second thorn. Vidyamaya is a second thorn to remove avidyamaya, and then you throw both thorns away, and what's left is baby kitten and the no free will. That's God realization. So you take the help of Vidyamaya to eliminate avidyamaya, to overcome avidyamaya, in order to ultimately realize God, which goes beyond even Vidyamaya. That's how I see it.
In some places in the Gospel, Ramakrishna talks about those who have realized live in a world of pure Vijamaya.
Interesting. I would love to see the reference in the Bengali.
That maybe I've interpreted it, maybe.
Yeah, that's really there. But he would say like Shankara kept Vidyar Ami. He kept the eye of knowledge after he attained Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But I don't think he says Vidya Maya. But still, Vijnanis, of course, they'll retain aspects of Vidya Maya in that sense. Like Bhakti, obviously they're Bhaktas. Vijnanis are Bhaktas, right? So in that sense. But there's a kind of pre-realization Vidya Maya, and then there's a post-realization use of Vidya Maya. Maybe that's like a parabola. Bhajananandaji is fond of parabolas, and there's seeing the world in the lower left-hand trough before you realize God, and then there's seeing the world after you've realized God. And you come back to the world, but you see a completely different world that's transformed.
Now, isn't there a space also where, this gets me a little bit confused, where people have some realization, but there's different levels of realization. And so Ramakrishna is saying that once one is realized, they totally know that only God is the doer. But don't they also decide to do certain things without it being, those who are very high like Ramakrishna, of course it's God deciding. But those who are in between, who have had some realization, but even non-dual, but I don't think that they always think that everything is the divine making them do everything.
I think for Sri Ramakrishna, realization is all or nothing. There might be divine visions and stuff, but God realization in the full-blown sense, you either have it or you don't. So I don't think that he's going to say that there's like a partial realization where you sort of feel that God is a doer, but sort of still feel that. I think that those cases where you're coming up with people who say that they're realized, but then they still maybe feel that they're doing things on their own, they may not be fully realized in that sense.
What's your definition of fully realized then?
Well, God realization. I don't know. What else do we say? you realize you realize God in your heart, and I think that in a sense you're saying, is there a kind of intermediate stage of realization where you get glimpses maybe of God, but where you lapse back into, that might be true. Might be true.
Well, even the Gita talks about realization and then established in that.
What are the terms in Sanskrit there in the Gita? Yeah, I'd have to look at because translations are always unreliable. Yeah. Thank you. That's a good question. Back there. Last question.
This is related to some of the things that I've already brought up. Okay, this is good. What role does karma play in the tethered cow model? Are we to think of God's will and God's grace as equivalent of the karma? My product of karma, is that affecting my free will?
Okay, so again, the cow in the post. People love the cow in the post. So I think I'm assuming that your question is coming from a standpoint of, I like the cow post analogy. Is that correct? So okay, so let me stick with the cow in the post, and then where does karma fit into the cow in the post? I think that basically the cow in the post will give you a model of karma that's not completely deterministic. So it won't say, you won't believe that karma determines literally everything you do. That's called radical karmic determinism. But instead, karma, so Yoga Sutra, for instance, some of you, I think this gentleman from Bulgaria, I'm sure has read the Yoga Sutra, and some other people. Karma determines jati, ayu, and bhoga, these three things. Jati means what species you're born into. Ayu, your lifespan. And bhoga, experiences of pleasure and pain. But there are certain things, but traditional Sankhya yogis like Arihananda Aranya, they still believe in free will. That karma doesn't completely determine everything we do. So it's kind of along the lines of Mahabharata, the statement that he was quoting from Draupadi. So that would align itself with more of the cow post. Now, the article that's about to come out in the Arindam Chakraborty fest strip that I've written on Swami Vivekananda's views on free will is called From Karmic Determinism to Divine Freedom for a reason. Because I think Swami Vivekananda makes these very strong statements about karmic determinism. Karma determines absolutely everything we do and think. Absolutely everything without any exception. So that will not lend itself to the cow and the post. So there are different views of karma based on how much free will you admit. And Swami Vivekananda, I think, admits no free will. He says in one place, free will is a misnomer. It's a contradiction in terms. And so as a result, his understanding of karma is radically deterministic. Karma determines absolutely everything, not only that we do physically, but actually even every thought that we think is also determined by karma. But the version you're talking about means karma is not completely determinative. Okay, thank you so much, guys. Should I end with
No,
one?
we'll have a song and then after.
Sounds good.
There's one online question, shall we?
Go ahead, quick.
Okay, online questions, one or two.
So Swamiji, as you have stated, many proponents of Vedanta say we do have free will to realize we can know our divine nature. But Buddhism believes we have no free will. Can you reconcile these two concepts?
Why should I? I mean, I think we should respect the uniqueness and differences across traditions. And the other thing is we should be careful about generalizing about Buddhism because there are many different traditions within Buddhism. And I think some of them probably do accept free will, at least limited free will. But secondly, you know what, I'll mention this. Mahayoganandaji, a monk in Hollywood, a brother monk of mine, he's big in the interfaith movement. He's the president of the Interfaith Council, and he often goes to interfaith meetings. And he says the thing that Buddhist representatives hate the most is when Vedantins come up and say, yeah, we believe what you believe. They hate it. They hate it with a passion. Because you're not honoring their own self-understanding. You know, grant them their own uniqueness. Let them have their own say. And then you can have a dialogue. Otherwise, you're just looking in a mirror.